18 minutes to 9 now, and as we've been reporting, all eyes will be on Holyrood this week, waiting to see if the Scottish Government brings out the big guns when it unveils its budget for the coming year. There's growing pressure on the Deputy First Minister John Swinney to use Holyrood's tax-raising powers to increase revenue and to protect public services and the lowest paid from the impact of the cost of living crisis. Speaking earlier on this programme, the Deputy Director of the Fraser of Allender Economic Research Institute, Emma Congreve, argued there's a case to be made for increasing the burden on better-off Scots.
When it comes to setting a draft budget for the year ahead, that's where there are more options available to the Scottish Government. So, of course, there's the obvious ones such as income tax, which the Scottish Government has used before and could use again to raise more money. And then there are other taxes such as the council tax, non-domestic rates, and then there are powers that the government has either through local government or through national government themselves to introduce new taxes.
Well, Craig Dalzell is the head of policy and research with the Commonweal, a think tank that develops policy and campaigns for social and economic equality. Good morning to you, Craig.
Good morning.
So we've got the STUC calling for John Swinney to increase taxes. We've heard there from the Fraser of Allender Economic Research Institute, which says there is a case to be made for it. What would you like to see John Swinney do?
Well, the STUC paper covers many of the same points that Commonweal's found in our own work, particularly in areas like property and land taxes. So I'd really like to see them explored in more detail. You'd
rather those were the first options to look at rather than tinkering around with income tax?
Well, income tax is very constrained with due to the devolved powers of Scotland. Many national level taxes are, but in areas of local taxes where they are funding local services, Scotland has much more options. So things like property taxes that affect that are locally collected, and a local land tax or even local wealth taxes are areas where Scotland has more options.
The Scottish Government often makes the point that its powers to carry out radical reform when it comes to taxes are limited. Would you agree with that?
Only if we are looking at the powers being held at Holyrood. If those powers are given to local authorities and local authorities are trusted to use those powers, then we do have more options there. Scotland is incredibly centralised. My local authority, South Lanarkshire, controls less than 15% of the public spending that affects me on a per capita basis. My German father-in-law, between his regional council and his municipal council, they control almost 30% of the public spending that affects him.
So what do you want here? Do you want councils to be able to set their own levels of taxes, or do you want council tax reformed? What would you see would be most useful in terms of protecting public services and those who are most at risk from the cost of living crisis?
Well, we all know that council tax as it stands is absurd. I mean, imagine if our income tax was based on our salary in 1991. So we need to reform that into a property tax based on a percentage of the current value of property.
The problem is that this is suggested every time, and successive governments have done absolutely nothing about it.
Yeah, because they've chosen not to. The powers are there. They have simply chosen not to do it. And that's the problem. That's the barrier I would like to overcome in this budget.
Why do you think they're not using it? Is it because it's too complicated, or is it because that raising council tax like that is never going to be popular?
I suspect it'll be popular for a lot of people. The vast majority of people are in houses that are badly misbanded and would actually get a tax cut from a property tax valuation, even if it was overall revenue neutral. I suspect the problem is partly because this would be a power given from Holyrood to local authorities. So it's a power distribution issue. I suspect also that there is an issue with the political capital involved. We saw how much political capital was expended a few years ago when income tax was changed marginally. But I don't think that's as big a barrier as we suspect it to be, because the opposition are going to complain whether it's a marginal change or a radical change. So the complaint is already priced in.
Well,
they may as well go for the radical option.
In terms of income tax, then, what would you like to see happen this Thursday? We know the STUC wants to see the better off pay more income tax, but they are suggesting that the better off starts at people paid around £40,000. That would include a lot of the train drivers and a lot of the teachers who are currently out on strike for more.
The fact that we're arguing whether or not folk on about £40,000 are rich or not, it really shows both how low paid Scotland and the UK is and how unequal that pay is, because you go a little bit further up that scale and you see pay really take off. I don't expect much to change with income tax. I think at best we'll see the bands adjust to bring them in broadly in line with the UK autumn statement. We might get a penny up on the top rate and a penny down in the bottom rate, but there's really not that much flexibility in income tax. That's why I'm really more interested in seeing a focus on other taxes like property and land.
Well, Craig, we must wait and see what the Finance Secretary John Swinney does on Thursday. Craig Dale there from the Commonweal. Thank you very much indeed.
For your views on all of that, that's Colin Wilkinson, MD for the Scottish Licensed Trade Association.
Well, we're going to step away from strikes at the moment, but we are going to talk about tax for a bit, which of course has been quite important when considering the issue of public sector pay rises. And this week it was announced that everyone in Scotland who earns more than £42,662 will be paying more income tax next year. The higher rate of tax is increasing from 41p to 42p in the pound in April. The top rate going from 46 to 47p. The tax threshold for the top rate is coming down from 150,000 to 125,000, or just over that. That's a change that has already been announced for other parts of the UK. Here, the Deputy First Minister John Swinney says he is asking people to pay their fair share to create a better society. But what about the issue of potentially more radical reforms of our tax system? For example, a flat tax where everyone pays the same, or a system commonly seen across Europe where rich people pay more tax compared to those on lower incomes, a more redistributive idea. Well, let's speak to Elliot Keck from the Taxpayers Alliance. They believe in a low tax society. Craig Dale also joins us from the Commonweal, which campaigns for economic equality. So firstly, Elliot, you are a fan of a flat tax then. Do you think that would be workable in a country like the UK?
Well, I certainly don't see any reason why it wouldn't be workable. We have a very, very long way to go. The idea behind a flat tax is that simple taxes are better than complicated taxes. And at the moment, we have an incredibly long tax code. In Scotland, there are 5 different income tax bands, and that is simply not good for the revenue raising capabilities of the government. It actually makes it more difficult for the government to raise money because there are more loopholes. And the idea of a flat tax is that it's not that everybody pays the same. Rich people will pay more inevitably because you pay, for example, the single income tax, which the TPA proposed, would be 30% of anything over a tax allowance. So, of course, rich people would inevitably pay more, but it's about removing all those complications and distortions that currently are in the system.
Well, Craig, if our tax system was going to be radically reformed, what kind of things would you like to see change?
Well, the thing with that flat tax idea is that if we were to move to that right now, and we could do that within the power of devolution if we kept the personal allowance the same. But I don't know if my counterpart would agree with me, but my back of the envelope calculation says that flat tax for a revenue neutral state, to have the same amount of income tax we generate in Scotland as the budget there, we'd need a flat tax of about 35%. If we kept the personal allowance, that's a tax rise of about £1,800 for a full-time minimum wage worker, whereas someone on 10 times that salary would get about a £7,000 tax cut. I don't think that's sustainable, especially given the previous segment talking about the downturn in the economy coming because people just can't go out and afford to participate in the economy, go to restaurants and pubs, etc.
So you would rather see something that's more redistributive then, if I could put it that way. So the higher earners pay much more, lower earners pay much less, or more lower earners pay nothing?
Well, yes, although as things stand right now, income tax in Scotland's probably about as progressive as it can go just because of the structure of everything. Swinney's increases won't raise all that much extra money, maybe about £200 million in real terms, according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I'd like to see much more of a focus on things like wealth taxes now. because wealth inequality is far higher than income inequality, and every reasonable economist from Adam Smith to Thomas Piketty recognises that that's a major driver of inequality across society, because it encourages rent seeking rather than productive economic investment.
Well, Elliot, a point that Craig was making there about a flat tax is that if it's a low flat tax, you potentially have to consider the issue of which social services you're going to cut. Then there's an argument about whether that leaves vulnerable people at risk, or if you have a higher flat tax, you're asking lower earners to pay the same level of tax as more well-off people, which might be a higher level and unaffordable.
Well, critically, it would be the same percentage, but the percentage of a higher level of income will inevitably more. But I mean, the Taxpayers Alliance proposal would be for a single income tax of 30%, but that would combine the 20p rate, or in Scotland there's a 19p, 20p and 21p, and the 12.5% rate of national insurance. So it would actually be a small tax cut for those on the lowest incomes. But we are firmly of the belief that if you introduce a flat tax, and if you have this radical simplification of the tax code, it would produce such benefits for economic growth, because businesses and consumers and individuals aren't spending such vast amounts of time working out how much tax they need to pay. You don't have to employ anything like the number of people at HMRC to track people down as to how much tax they should pay. And we are firmly of the belief that the significant impact it would have on economic growth over the short, medium and long term would be such that actually public services would probably only need a gentle bit of trimming, which I think if you look at the amount that we're spending on them is clearly the case anyway.
Craig, when you consider the issue of getting more well-off people, or getting wealthy people to pay more tax, do you think that's always a bit politically tricky? Because one of the issues that governments and politicians have to consider is that if we make the wealthy people pay a certain amount of tax, they're quite a mobile bunch of people, and they might just leave, and then all of a sudden you're losing a big bit of your tax base.
Well, that's another reason my focus is on wealth taxes in Scotland, and they would primarily come in the form of property taxes. So I would reform council tax into something that's based on the percentage of the current value of a home, because right now council tax is very nearly a flat tax in Scotland. A house that's worth 10 or even 100 times the price of my house only pays about 3.5 times as much council tax. If it costs 1,000 times more, it still pays the same, or about 3.5 times as much council tax. And I want to see land taxes. And those two taxes, property taxes and land taxes, it doesn't matter where in the world you live. If you live in a tax haven, if you live in Scotland, you live in anywhere else, if you own that property in Scotland, you're liable for the tax. It can't be avoided that way.
Do you think there's a potential issue there about someone who has maybe lived in a house most of their life, the mortgage is paid off, and then the value of the house simply increases because that's what property prices do? It's not necessarily kind of a wealthy person living in the house.
That is an issue with moving to a property tax like this, although for the vast majority of people in Scotland, a percentage property tax would actually be a tax cut, because the council tax is so badly broken that most houses in Scotland are badly misbanded. For those few people who are in that situation, we at Commonweal argue for phasing in of the tax to make it easier to cope with, and for other measures, discounts and whatnot, to try and ease that in.
Elliot, do you accept that some public services would have to be cut under a flat tax system?
Yes, I mean, we call for cuts of public spending. We've seen public spending reach simply unsustainable heights. I think total managed expenditure in the United Kingdom as a whole is now heading towards £1 trillion every year.
What would you cut then? Which services would you cut then?
So I don't think there's absolutely no need to cut any of the absolute core services that we rely on. What you need to do is you need to look at some of particularly the wasteful areas. But just take for one example, the Arts Council recently announced about £400-500 million of funding, and I think that's one place where you could immediately look at significantly cutting spending, given some of the projects that they are funding. But really, right across the public sector, you are seeing extraordinary amounts of waste, whether it's the massive diversity agenda that you see right across public service that's costing hundreds of millions of pounds a year. I think there's many areas that you could look at cutting.
Okay, thank you very much both for joining us. Elliot Keck there from the Taxpayers Alliance, and Craig Dalzell from Commonweal.
No.